What's going on? We're going to take a look at politics by examining our social contract and proposing one that makes sense. Many Western countries presently use a system that champions freedom, equality, and the empirical method. These are generally classified as Enlightenment ideals. What makes this so difficult is that all argument must start with assumptions, including logic. Logic cannot be disproved without using logic. Occam's razor means that we need to explain as much as we can with the fewest number of assumptions. In this video, there are 9 assumptions that are believed to exist in any and every universal social agreement. The 9 assumptions that make up the contract will be read as statements, and each of these statements will require consensus. If there is no consensus, then the contract is null and void. It kicks off with the statement that I am a thinking person, otherwise stated as I am free to reason. This leads us to acknowledge a shared experience that in turn requires a shared language. Using a shared language, we can present and accept that a general will exists if we all share a universal desire, such as protecting our freedom. An agreement on the general will allows us to have a social contract, which implies tacit consent and then further implies equal representation. Finally, to share authority, we must justify all state plans. The empirical method, which entails the burden of proof, falsification, and prediction, must be used to justify any demand for action. If the empirical method is used to achieve the goal of protecting everyone's freedom, then we can be maximally certain about 3 things. Simply stated, these are the law of life, law of liberty, and the law against harm. We will briefly touch on the protection of property at the end of the video, but it is generally beyond the scope of this argument. It all starts with cogito, ergo sum, Descartes' famous saying, I am thinking, therefore I am. If you were to doubt this phrase, you would have to participate in the act of thinking. You cannot doubt that you are thinking without thinking. All of that we call experience, including the experience of I am thinking, is contingent on 4 presuppositions that are detailed here. These are logic, space-time, causality, and the unity of consciousness. You can pause the video at any point to read through a provided definition. For now, we push forward. The very first assumption that we have to make is that I am free to reason. To accept this, we need to first define the key terms free and reason, as well as some of the major words within these definitions. Reason is the reproduction of a concept in imagination according to a rule. Freedom is a person's capability of acting in adherence or non-adherence to a rule. And so if we accept that we are persons free to reason, then we can move on to the next premise. The second premise is an either-or statement, where the conclusion cannot be both. Either there is more than one person, or there is only one person, called solipsism. A person is plainly defined as a conscious unity free to reason. From this either-or proposition, called an exclusive disjunctive, both cannot be true. And so we must accept that there is more than one person. To be clear, solipsism is the view or theory that the self is all that can be known to exist. This is related to simulation theory, or the matrix, and it might include theories that we exist in the mind of some brain in a vat, or a turtle's dream. Solipsism can't actually be disproved. If only one mind exists, then there really isn't any point to discussing social agreements or politics. So to share experience, we need to reject solipsism. We arrive at a conditional premise that says if experience is shared universally with all other persons, then all persons must share a language, otherwise known as a political language. Now, to share some sort of universal language, it cannot contain contradictions, or it would be incoherent to those adhering to reason. Political language, then, must be a rational language. That is our third assumption. Once we've established a consensus for the first 3 assumptions, we can define a term called the general will. The general will is a universally ideal effect that all persons want to cause. The fourth statement, then, is that the general will exists, and that the general will retains its freedom. That means everybody universally shares a desire to retain their freedom. The next premise is another either-or statement, and it is connected to the general will. It states that either all persons consent to at least one plan, or all persons do not consent to at least one plan. If we accept that retaining freedom is a universal ideal, then all persons must consent to plans that protect their freedom. This means that all persons would consent to at least one plan. When this is accepted, we enter what is called the social contract. If we agree to a social contract, then we must assume that all persons tacitly consent. Since the social contract serves a universal desire, we must assume that all persons will consent to a plan that works toward consensus goals. This kind of consent does not require any ongoing or explicit verification, and it is commonly known as tacit consent. If we have tacit consent for a consensus goal, then we must assign equal rights to all persons. This means that all persons must be equally represented by any shared or political plan that assumes tacit consent. A valid and sound social contract provides all persons with political equality without requiring an argument for moral essence. If all persons must be equally represented by shared plans, then these authoritative demands for action, or state plans, must be justified to all persons. The states, or social contract institutions, must share the authority to demand action and adherence to its plan. To share authority for making demands, the plans must be justified. What does it mean to justify a state's plan in a way that can be shared by everyone? Empirical justification is an open access, unbiased, equitable, and rational system that denies knowledge if it cannot possibly be challenged. This is why justified plans must be empirical. An empirical approach requires a claim to meet the burden of proof by using a falsifiable method that predicts a necessary effect. To explain the burden of proof, a justified claim must be tested for contradiction to demonstrate its necessity of connection. A falsifiable method ensures that it must be possible to disprove a claim with tests. And predictive claims are rules that causally connect to a necessary effect. Since our senses can be misleading and chance exists, we can never use empiricism to conclude absolute certainty. Since political laws must be determined with the empirical method, the strength of a claim must be proportioned to the strength of its evidence. Carl Sagan reinforced this point with the statement, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." This has become known as the Sagan standard. In a minimal justified state, centralized power must only threaten to intervene with other people if they don't adhere to the strongest claims. The severity of threat against non-adherence must also be determined by the strength of the political claim. The acceptance of these 9 assumptions leads us to 3 major political laws that can be developed to protect freedom using the empirical method. These are the law of life, law of liberty, and law against harm. Laws concerning liberty would deny actions such as slavery and rape. A rough proposal for another shared goal suggests that the state may also be used to provide justice for contracts that protect property acquired in a free market exchange. Without universal consensus, though, all justified exchanges would require explicit consent. We would also need to satisfy the social contract laws before addressing further goals. Ultimately, one real-world application of this theory is the recognition of what we are neglecting in our modern politic. In many areas, our society is aligned with these propositions. But right now, we do not defend against the threat of starvation and the threat of hypothermia or heat stroke. These attack freedom and must be protected against. Given that our world is resistant to change, the most agreeable adjustment might be to implement a tax program for food and shelter, something like a universal basic income. Beyond this, we are probably outside of the Overton window. People don't like change, but if you value the benefit of using rational rules to lead our politic and share experience, then you should be eager to modify your position.